Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 5th of July and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First, we will look at today's coronavirus update, and then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will look at the news headlines together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,296,911 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK's government's regional testing centres. Of these, 1,999,426 have been confirmed negative, and 297,485 have tested positive. There are 2,372 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at a total of 7,729. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 338 were in hospital last night, 30 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,869,223 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,774,136 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 128,231 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 9 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not only in hospitals. Now, having given you the coronavirus update for today, I'm delighted to say that we are joined this evening by the retired consultant and HR professional and now prolific commentator, Peter Curran. Peter, how are you this evening?
I'm well. I'm glad you didn't get me yesterday because I wouldn't have been much use to you, but today I'm fine.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that, and I'm very pleased to see you this evening, Peter. Our first story this evening is that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced that he still intends to push ahead with step 4 of his lockdown lifting roadmap on the 19th of July. This, of course, applies only in England, not in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. The PM stated that although hospital admissions are rising and COVID deaths will continue, he plans to bin the regulations on mask wearing, social distancing and working from home, and have the public use their own judgment to mitigate the risk of COVID-19 infection. People will merely be advised to consider wearing a mask in crowded spaces where they mingle with people they would not ordinarily meet. Drinking at bars will also return as all social distancing requirements for leisure and hospitality will be dropped. Full capacity at sports and entertainment events can proceed, including elite sport, pop concerts and nightclubs. The only regulation that will remain is the requirement to isolate after testing positive for COVID-19, as well as some remaining restrictions on international travel. The change has prompted a significant backlash from regional mayors who have called for mask wearing to be retained on transport and in retail settings. Leila Moran, the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, has also voiced her concern that the UK government's rush to drop remaining measures risks exposing many more people to the devastating impact of long COVID. The Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, today admitted that we do not yet know whether the vaccine weakens or breaks the link completely with long COVID. A final decision on whether to proceed with step 4 of the roadmap in England will be taken in 1 week's time. Now, Peter, as I've said, this story relates exclusively to England and not to any of the other nations in the United Kingdom. But as a starter for 10, what's your initial reaction to the news that Boris plans to bin almost all of the restrictions?
Well, trying to put partisan, constitutional and national, in the sense of Scotland, England, differences out of the equation. One, I recognise that a UK Prime Minister and a Scottish First Minister have to, at some point in time, embrace some kind of an exit plan. I mean, the damage from COVID is patent and documented, but so also is the damage from resisting COVID. The economic damage, the damage to the health service, people. So I don't particularly want to understand Boris in any shape or form, but I do understand any PM's dilemma. What worries me deeply about it is Boris has always wanted life to be simpler than it is. This is not the kind of PM-ship he signed up for. He wanted to relax, make a few grandiose statements, delegate everything to subordinates in the civil service or his junior ministers. And he's being forced to be at the apex of major decisions that affect lives. I think the worm in the apple is we need the consent of the people. That's certainly the maxim that's been accepted by all governments. We need the acceptance of the people for these restrictions. We haven't gone the draconian route of making them hard-edged, enforceable, on-the-spot law in the vast majority of situations. But the good sense of the people, when there has been any relaxation, however slight, hasn't been in much evidence from their behaviour at beaches and the early ones where they dived onto the beaches en masse. And I have to say, the football aspect of it seems, as someone who's resolutely non-sporting, so I declare an interest there, sport seems to trump everything. And I do think Nicola was very ill-advised at some of the events that she gave permission for and gave, if not active endorsement, tacit endorsement to. But I think exactly the same is true in England. And I worry at this sudden total dropping of all the norms that have been at such pains to inculcate into people of behaviour, to the degree that to most of us, to some degree, wearing a mask, maintaining a decent social distance, being cautious about who you eat in crowds and where. If suddenly that is relaxed, I think there's a whole segment of the population who will say, that's the green light to behave as this had never happened. And I do think a more, I hate to use the word nuance, because nuance contradicts what I'm saying about the behaviour of population. A more delicate approach might have been necessary. I worry because most of my family is in England and many long-term friends, colleagues, etc. So I worry for England and I also worry for what Nicola might do or might not be tempted not to do in Scotland. For once, I welcome Nicola's innate caution. And in this case, I think extreme caution is required. But ask the $64 billion question, what would I have done in Boris's place? The answer is, I just don't know. The decisions of mind-bending complexity. All I can say is focus on the facts, listen to the medical professionals, take the key advice from the key quarters that they value, and don't make grandiose gestures.
It's an interesting point that you make, Peter, given that most of the commentary we've heard from Westminster over the last 48 hours has come from the Housing Minister and the new Health Secretary, neither of whom are experts in matters of public health. But you mentioned caution and people being cautious. It was mentioned during the Prime Minister's press conference this afternoon that he wants other people to be cautious in making their own decisions about whether and where to wear masks and how to behave. Now, the Prime Minister strikes me as somebody who's never been cautious himself. certainly in matters over which he had some control himself. So it struck me as a bit odd that he's expecting other people to be cautious when he's one of the least cautious people I can think of.
Yeah, indeed. As an old film buff in every sense of the word, Andrew, I remember the second of the two classic Frankenstein movies. And in the second movie, the monster had been promoted to be Dr. Frankenstein. So he was, in fact, the doctor. And the guy on the bench, the monster, was Glenn Strange, who later turned up as the barman in one of the old cowboy films. And the monster is begging to be released from the bench. And Dr. Frankenstein's leaning over him and saying, well, yes, I have to release you to see how you perform. But if I release you, will you be a good monster and promise not to rampage? And there's a wonderful still from the film where the doctor's looking appealingly at the monster on the bench, and the monster is nodding his head and saying, yes, I'll be a good monster. And you can see the thought bubble above his head. And when I get up, the first thing I'll do is rip your head, arms, and legs off. So I think that's the position he's in. Boris wants to have his cake and eat it, as always. He wants to get all the kudos for the relaxation of the regulations, but he's setting up his fall guy, which was, yes, I did the right thing, but the people behaved irresponsibility. Isn't that monstrous? So that's Boris's approach. Give somebody a license. When they exercise it wrongly, disclaim them totally. So it's impossible for me to be more cynical about Boris. I can't be more cynical than I am about a lying, adulterous old Etonian.
Absolutely, Peter. One other thing, coming to you because of your background and your experience, since the Prime Minister's press conference, as I said, the local mayors have been criticising the announcement, but more from to talk to you about it. Both the teaching unions and the transport unions have already come out to say that they're very concerned about this apparent abandoning of wearing of face coverings in indoor settings and settings which present greater risk. The Prime Minister answered that by saying again that it's a matter for personal decisions, and also advised that businesses who were requiring masks to be worn should take legal advice as regards Equalities Act issues. Now that struck me again as a little bit of the Prime Minister deflecting responsibility onto other people. However, with regard to the views of the teaching unions and the transport workers unions, from your perspective, what do you think the managers and those responsible for education and transportation, what are they going to have to do in dealing with the trades unions who have now made their position very clear?
Well, there is nothing that I can see to stop a large company or indeed a large school to enforce their own rules in the normal way they would of good behaviour. So if they feel this way, they have to look at what measure of discretion they have to offset this. But I mean, if I was in business, or if I was back in the brewing industry or the rubber industry facing that, I would say, well, okay, but what are my responsibilities to my people and indeed to my company? I mean, at the end of the day, if I was operating in a dangerous plant, as I did for 14 years in the Goodyear tire and rubber plant, you take external advice, but at the end of the day, if the bloody place blows up, you have a dust explosion, a volatile toxin explosion, somebody falls into a crunching roller machine, it's you that are responsible at that point in time. And faced with a Boris heading the pyramid, I would say, well, I'm not going to get any help from that quarter. He'll take any opportunity to lay off the blame. But it does illustrate another point for me, Andrew, that all of this, what they are saying and what Boris is saying in response, all of that should be done by pre-consultation with these kinds of people before he came anywhere making his decision as announced at 5 o'clock. As always, this government doesn't let you into what it's doing. It doesn't truly communicate with the people it needs to, and indeed with its own support. Can I say there's another government further north who's frequently guilty of exactly the same mistakes, but we'll leave this one with Boris for the moment.
Yes, that's a good point. I suppose in circumstances where the lockdowns were being applied, where restrictions were increasing, then I suppose governments might say that they were under an even greater pressure to act quickly, and consultation wasn't possible in those circumstances. But that's not where we are now. This plan for unlocking has been in place for months. And as you say, there's been no consultation. Do you think that is just another reflection of an innate wish by this Tory government to avoid all scrutiny, if at all possible?
I think it's that, but I think it's rooted in Toryism. I mean, the whole concept of what we're doing to control COVID is alien to the core Tory philosophy, which crudely expressed could be maximum empowerment of the individual, regardless of the impact on others. In other words, it comes very close to being a libertarian philosophy. So I think he's under huge economic pressures from the people who want, I mean, the sporting pressure. I mean, I was faced with the fact that, like an idiot, I forgot today that Politics Live had shifted to 9:15 instead of 12:15. Now, I do watch Politics Live. It's very valuable, especially under the chairmanship of Joe Coburn, insight into what's going on in Westminster and UK politics, and indeed sometimes world politics. Why am I denied it? Because everybody wants to watch two people patting a ball back and forth across a net at each other. Now, it's not the innate morality and benefit to humanity of the great game of tennis that's doing it. It's big money that's driving it. And quite simply, that took precedence over keeping the nation informed at a crucial point of the day, midday, about what's happening in a nation facing climate change, nuclear extinction, and death by COVID. So it's a question of sense of priorities that's coming through.
Oh, it's a good point you make, Peter. I suppose we've seen that all the way through the pandemic. We've seen that all the way through the pandemic, with the Grand National going ahead in 2020, and there was a European football game in the weeks before lockdown came in. So I absolutely understand the point that you're making. Perhaps one of the benefits in coming out of COVID will be that people's priorities are maybe revised a little bit. But we should move on to the next story we have this evening. And that is that the SNP has called fresh claims from Dominic Cummings that Boris Johnson would shut down Holyrood utterly devastating. Boris Johnson's former right-hand man Dominic Cummings told the National newspaper that the Prime Minister thinks devolution was a disaster and that he would like to reverse it if he could, casting fresh doubt on the future of the Scottish Parliament under the Westminster Tories. MSP Rona Mackay said that if these claims are true, it is an utterly devastating revelation for the unionist cause in Scotland. Ms Mackay said, "It lays bare the undeniable threat Boris Johnson and his Tories pose towards the very future of our democratically elected Scottish Parliament. His former right-hand man makes clear they would scrap Holyrood if they thought that they could get away with it." The East Dunbartonshire MSP warned that a threat to Scotland's powers is already fully underway, as Boris Johnson has been undermining the Scottish Parliament by stealth, by grabbing powers through the Internal Market Bill and the Shared Prosperity Fund. And the UK government is currently challenging Holyrood's powers to protect the rights of children in the UK Supreme Court. So, Peter, first of all, scrapping Holyrood would involve scrapping the rights of Scottish voters, wouldn't it?
Yes, but let me say, first of all, if Rona Mackay and the SNP were totally devastated and surprised at this, I don't know where the hell they've been since the genesis of the idea of devolution. The Tories have been solidly opposed to devolution all along, and only reluctantly persuaded of it, and some of them dramatically. The Tam Dael is a classic example, not persuaded at all that it's the high road to independence. So certainly I'm not devastated, horrified, and sure as hell I'm not surprised. I never doubted that that was Boris's position. I never doubted that that was their intent. And the fact that he said it in an aside doesn't surprise me one little bit. The Tories got one hell of a fright. In fact, Unionists in total got one hell of a fright in 2014. And I'm sure they regarded, and rightly so, devolution as one of the main reasons that they got themselves into such a pig's mess. And if they can neuter it, let's do it. I mean, they're bandying about things at the moment on there's a letter, I think, in the Herald today about the outrage of Scots defying the law in the Scotland Act. I mean, the law of what country? The country that we're trying to exit from, the dysfunctional conglomerate called the United Kingdom, their law, which is a relic of empire and is designed to hold that empire together, or our Scottish law, ancient law, so why be surprised about these things?
Well, it's an interesting point, Peter. If we think this week that we've seen the Prime Minister standing in Downing Street, standing on top of a St George's cross, which was tailored to fit from gutter to gutter in Downing Street, in quite an alarming display of support for one part of the United Kingdom, do you think that if this reporting of what Dominic Cummings has said, if what Cummings has said is true, do you think that gives us an insight into the way in which Johnson also views the settlement in Northern Ireland and potentially the settlement in Wales as well?
Well, an insight for those that need it is what I would say. And I have no doubt how Johnson sees himself. He sees himself as Prime Minister of England, what's left of the British Empire, which what he'd really like to have been Prime Minister of. And with some rest of, but not sufficiently docile colonies. I've no doubt that's his view, and a view of a major number of Tories. It's the view of a large chunk of Oxbridge academics who were key architects of the Union and the myth of the Union as we know it now, and are still defending it. We can think of a few historians one might mention in that respect. So why does this surprise anybody? Of course, Johnson doesn't give a damn about the Union. Johnson would settle tomorrow for an England on its own, free from because he doesn't understand the impact of losing a third of his landmass and God knows what percentage of his coastline in key assets. He doesn't understand these things. He's living a boy's own paper fantasy. He's one step above Billy Bunter in his thinking. Why we should expect anything of this man or any of the people he's gathered around him, God knows. Cummings understood him. And Cummings' own peculiar view of political reality was prepared to make that compromise to get near the source of power. Undoubtedly, Dominic Cummings ever saw Boris Johnson other than totally clearly for what he is. So,
absolutely.
I'm inclined to say, so what? We know all that. That's why we're trying to get the hell out of it.
Of course. We'll move on to the next story. No, your exasperation is entirely reasonable in the circumstances. Let's move on to the next story now. The SNP has urged the UK government to put public health first and support an amendment to the police bill requiring a review of criminal offences under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Anne McLaughlin MP has tabled the amendment on behalf of the SNP parliamentary group to help secure a public health approach to drug use rather than the failed UK government approach of criminalising drug users. The SNP Justice spokesperson said, "The Westminster war on drugs has been an abject failure for more than 50 years, since the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, and warned the failed approach is contributing towards drugs deaths by treating large swathes of society as criminals and preventing people from receiving support for addictions. Now, Peter, we know that a public health-based approach that was pioneered in Glasgow in respect of knife crime is regarded as having been a considerable success, and indeed, there are moves to attempt to learn from and perhaps import some of the principles and operational ideas from Glasgow to London in an attempt to address their knife crime crisis. It seems curious that we've had such resistance from Westminster to adopting a similar approach, a public health approach, in addressing what is a significant public health issue in Scotland. Why do you think Westminster is so resistant to dragging drugs policy into the 21st century?
Well, drugs policy hasn't even been dragged into the 20th century as it is at the moment. I mean, this debate mirrors a debate that's been going on for well over half a century in America and in Britain. I mean, exactly the same words, the same usage, why criminalise users, etc., etc. There's a great line divides society at the moment, and it's mirrored in the huge division in America, it's mirrored in Europe. One part of the population has a quasi-moralistic religious view of politics. Their politics is not driven by any of the realities of politics, the real politique. I don't think any of them. Boris allegedly is a classical scholar. He should read some of his Plato and Aristotle. He should read the people who, in effect, invented democracy. Politics was developed to allow people to resolve their differences peaceably on the fundamental way in which the society they exist in should be defined, namely its territories and its limits, how its laws should be set, and how its representative government, if indeed there was a representative government, was set up. But for a whole range of people, that doesn't matter. I mean, every day we hear people stating, first of all, their personal morality. I belong to the church of so-and-so XXY, founded in 1919, and my church's teaching, which trumps all governments, etc., says that. You only have to listen to any American Republican talking about issues that confront public behavior, whether it's personal morality, sexual morality, race, anything else. They're not driven by the rational political decisions of equity and justice. They're driven by deep fundamental beliefs. They believe people who take drugs are bad. They don't have to take drugs. They don't need it. They should restrain themselves. When you say that about drug addicts, it reminds me of Billy Connolly's statement about, as brought up as a Catholic, being urged to adopt the rhythm method for birth control. So in a sense, we're asking drug addicts to adopt the rhythm message for birth control. And as Billy Connolly observed, when he was close to that important point, wild horses wouldn't have induced him to withdraw. And wild horses won't induce these people to withdraw either. It's rooted in their whole concept of Toryism.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Peter.
I'm totally behind the Scottish government's position, by the way. Why they're doing it, I don't know. We don't want to be part of this country.
Yes,
when
yes,
did
absolutely.
they hope to influence it, and for how long?
Yes.
We should be doing this ourselves.
Yes, precisely. I think both in Westminster, but more importantly in Holyrood. I think that's very fair. We need to move on to our next story now, which is that new analysis from the House of Commons Library shows that UK state pensions are the lowest as a proportion of pre-retirement wages of all of our European neighbours. UK pensioners receive around a quarter, 28%, of the average working wage when they retire. That is in stark contrast with pensioners in Luxembourg and Austria, who receive 90% of the average working wage. The net replacement rate measures how effectively a pension system provides a retirement income to replace earnings. It divides pension entitlement by pre-retirement earnings, taking into account personal income taxes and social security contributions paid by workers and pensioners. It includes state pensions and mandatory employment pensions, all statutory enforced pensions. This analysis using OECD data shows that the UK net replacement rate is lower than all 13 neighbouring European countries, including France at 74% and Austria and Luxembourg at 90%. The figures also show that pensioners in independent countries of Scotland's size or smaller receive a much higher proportion of the average working wage, 64%, than UK pensioners, and more than the average of all countries in North West Europe, which is 62%. The findings follow the publication of the UK government's households below average income statistics in March, which revealed UK pensioner poverty levels have risen to a 15-year high, with 2.1 million UK pensioners now living in poverty after housing costs, and that's an increase of 200,000 people on 2018-2019. So, Peter, the matter of pension provision is maybe something that's a little closer to your heart and to my heart, perhaps. What do you think that this analysis from the House of Commons Library tells us about Tory priorities in the United Kingdom at the moment?
Well, it tells us, again, sorry to labour the point, but what we already always know, that Tory priorities are to make the rich richer, if necessary, at the expense of making the poor poorer. And pensioners, other than in consumption terms, are not a producing, contributing part of the economy. So no surprise there. I was very interested in pensions, one, because in human resources we were involved in. I mean, think of this, Andrew. Long-term planning. What do we think of long-term planning? Something 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, 25 years ahead. I regularly, as a personnel professional, a personnel director, made a commitment to an 18-year-old employee joining our company as to what we would pay them in a pension 47 years hence. The pensions are the ultimate long-term planning. And quite simply, any country should be measured on its scale of humanity, its index of humanity, how it deals with its most vulnerable and how it deals with its elderly in their final years after what hopefully was a productive life. Now, during the 2014 referendum campaign, the pensions thing came up again and again. Typically, the UK government's approach was to raise scare stories about the Scottish government's ability to fund the pension, some of which were straightforward, blatant, down-the-middle lies. They were saying that pensions which were guaranteed by law and by English law, company pensions, which weren't controlled by government at all, wouldn't be paid somehow. So yes, it's a scandal. Yes, it's a disgrace. Yet again, it's no surprise. I can only ask myself why something around half of Scots, a chunk of whom either are or will be pensioners, cannot see what is being done to them.
That's a very good point, Peter. I hope that the message starts to, perhaps there's a chance now that the message will start to sink in, now that the House of Commons Library are providing this kind of data. But what we'll do now, we'll turn to what might be described as another Tory priority, and that's because an MP has criticised the Tory government for wasting £160,000 of taxpayers' money on recruiting a so-called Brexit Opportunities Director. Drew Hendry MP said that the public would be astonished that the Tories are throwing away even more taxpayers' money on Brexit, having already cost the UK billions of pounds since the EU referendum. The UK government has paid a recruitment firm £43,000 to help employ a director who will earn an annual salary of £120,000 a year. Commenting, Drew Hendry said, "It beggars belief that the Tory government is whittling away another £160,000 of taxpayers' money on a Brexit bureaucrat, having already cost Scotland billions of pounds through their Brexit obsession." Now, Peter, as we've mentioned, you had many years working in personnel and in HR. So now we have a recruitment. We've had a pensions question, and now we've got a recruitment question for you. What do you think? How do you think you would measure the value and the success of the performance of someone who is apparently being employed to identify Brexit opportunities 5 years after the referendum?
Well, that's like asking the Irishman for directions. I can say this because I'm Irish. And he said, if you want to get there, I wouldn't start from here. So the real question is, does the United Kingdom need a Brexit Opportunities Director? Well, of course it does. Brexit is delivering disabling, damaging blows to our economy by the day. And therefore, something has to be done about it. And you can call them an opportunities director, a Brexit SAR or something. But yeah, if they need a high-powered guy to get their act together, I think they're possibly underpaying for the scale of the task. I mean, they'll pay the head of a bloody pub chain who manages to get half the population's livers fall down their trouser leg by the time they're 40, 10 times that as the CEO. So I've got no problems with the Tories trying to repair the damage they have done by Brexit, whether it's the right way to do it. But focusing on 160k, I mean, I wish I'd ever earned that. I wish I had something like it. Is not a dramatic sum of money for somebody. I sound like an defender of the Tories. I'm defending any government, whether it was Labour. Let's say SNP had engineered Brexit and balls it up. They would happily spend that kind of money and somebody they thought could put a firecracker under people to fix it. So I don't understand the relevance of this story. Otherwise, and it's an easy point to score, or seems like it. I mean, that's a fair point.
That's a fair point, Peter. We were talking earlier on about the Prime Minister often looking for people to deflect responsibility for things onto. It maybe that this Brexit Opportunities Director, even at as you say, at £120,000 per year, is to be a fall guy for Johnson and the Brexit project. But what we'll do is we'll come back to a discussion on COVID a little bit, albeit from a Northern European perspective, because Norway has announced the easing of some COVID-19 restrictions today, but has delayed the final phase of reopening the economy until the end of this month, at the earliest, because of concerns about the Delta coronavirus variant. Measures that will remain include bars and restaurants being limited to table service, limits of 20 people at gatherings in private homes, and restrictions on adult recreational sports. These measures could have been lifted today if the government had given the go-ahead to enter the fourth and final phase of ending Norway's national lockdown. There is a risk that the Delta variant will cause a fourth wave of infection in the unvaccinated part of the population, among those who have only received one dose or who are in vulnerable groups, the Prime Minister Erna Solberg said. The World Health Organization has said the Delta strain is becoming the globally dominant variant of COVID-19, raising concerns about whether existing vaccines will work against it. It could become the dominant variant in Norway this month, the Health Minister has said. Almost two-thirds of adults in Norway have received a first dose of COVID-19 vaccine, and 37% of adults are fully vaccinated, according to the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. The Nordic country is also considering vaccinating 16 and 17-year-olds, with a final decision expected in September, the government said. Moves to ease the lockdown include allowing more people from Thursday to attend outdoor and indoor public events, provided there is testing for the virus and attendees can produce certificates showing information on the bearer's most recent vaccination, recovery from COVID-19 infection in the past 6 months, and the most recent negative test result. Outdoor events with an unseated audience, such as music festivals, will be allowed to house 3,000 people, an increase from 2,000. Under a measure that has already been announced, from today, quarantine-free travel is permitted from a number of European countries, including the popular tourist destinations of France, Croatia, and Italy. Now, Peter, one thing that struck me with regard to this story is that there has been criticism of the Westminster government in respect of its point-blank refusal to attempt to look and listen and learn from the experience and the work done in any other country. There has been criticism that the UK government, for example, refused to pay any attention to the comparatively successful measures taken in countries such as South Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Now we see Norway in this case taking what might be described as a more measured, step-by-step, not a big bang approach to bringing the lockdown restrictions to an end. So, do you think that this contrast between London and Norway, do you think that tells us something about the way in which the Westminster government is approaching the stage of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, yes, indeed, it does, Andrew. The first thing it tells us, which I suspect most people already know, is that this government predicates itself on the unquestionable dominance and excellence of everything British, and by that, everything English in terms of English government. So to acknowledge that anybody else is doing anything better in governmental terms is seen as a sign of weakness. And of course, what that is a sign of weakness in these people, because anybody who's come close to anybody of huge talent, whether it's sporting, scientific, musical, knows they are wide open to the experience of other people. They welcome it, they learn. They're absolute learning and adapting machines. So that shows the whole weakness of the ethos that pertains in Britain. It's an empirical ethos that has lingered on. We are better at everything. We have nothing to learn from anybody. But Norway and these other countries seem to understand something that we don't, even if the government's scientific advisors understand it. What COVID is a life form, and what the Tory government is and the Westminster government is a life form. Life forms are born, they come into existence, they have a drive to survive, they have a drive to multiply, and they have a drive to consume. The problem is the Delta variant has encompassed, the COVID in its entire inception from late 2019 till now, has probably in historical timescales and reproductive generations past a point that goes roughly back to the domestication of the dog in human history. This is a life form struggling to survive by consuming and inhabiting and destroying another life form. Now, in the process, of course, the variant destroys itself. It destroys humanity. It destroys its host. But Norway always seemed to be one of the most eminently sensible countries on the globe. I suppose if your balls are freezing off half the year, it focuses the mind wonderfully. You haven't got time for relaxed fantasies. Indeed, well, the brass monkeys were actually the cannonballs on the holders. They're called the brass monkeys. And they froze in the cold. But yeah, using the monkey and that. So it shows an unwillingness of this government to be guided by fact, rationality, or a clear-eyed view of history. I have some issue with historians whether history can predict the future.
Absolutely.
What I do say, if you don't know your history, then you're condemned to repeat it. That's as sure as hell. But I despair of this government. And I have a solution. I want out. I want Scotland to be independent. I want the SNP to stop rabbiting on, Boris must do this, Boris must do that, parading in Westminster, trying to change a regime and an institution that we want to get the hell out of as soon as possible.
Of course.
Emulate the virus.
Yes, absolutely. We'll touch now on a story that relates to something you've mentioned already this evening, and that is that the European Commission is drafting plans to set an EU-wide minimum tax rate for polluting aviation fuels, as it seeks to meet more ambitious targets to fight climate change. The European Commission plans an overhaul of EU energy taxation as part of a package of measures it will propose on July 14 to meet a target to reduce EU greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 from 1990 levels. A draft of the Commission's tax proposal takes aim at aviation, which escapes EU fuel taxes at the moment. The proposal would impose an EU-wide minimum level of tax on energy products supplied as aircraft fuel for flights within the EU. From 2023, the minimum tax rate for aviation fuel would start at zero and increase gradually over a 10-year period until the full rate is imposed. The draft proposal did not specify what the final rate would be. Sustainable fuels, including renewable hydrogen and advanced biofuels, would not face minimum EU taxes during that 10-year period. So, Peter, whilst any announcement of any measures to seek to begin to cut greenhouse gas and carbon emissions are to be welcomed, do you think that this goes far enough or fast enough?
No, it clearly doesn't. The question is, can it? I mean, one of the great tragedies of us coming out of the EU is the EU is big enough to fight the people who will resist any attempt to stop their intention to make money, regardless of the price paid by the planet. I don't know how many people saw or read about the scandal exposed significantly, and to their huge credit by Channel 4, of the ExxonMobil attempts to distort reality, to systematically lie about the whole question of climate change, and it's simply so they could continue raping the planet, extracting as much oil as they could, making as much money as they could, regardless of the impact. Now, the EU is big enough and organised enough to oppose these things and have a chance of doing something about it. Britain on its own has no chance and would lack the will totally under its present view of what constitutes Britain and its values. So does it go far enough? No, it doesn't. I mean, we're now in a shrinking 10-year window. It may already be too late. Unless we're radical, unless we come to grips with these vested interests. And it can be done. I mean, Channel 4, it's no accident, by the way, that the BBC behind the scenes and the Tory government in front of the scenes are trying to privatise Channel 4. I mean, Channel 4 with the Guardian newspaper, both of their faults, but they're probably the twin only sources of objective moral analysis of world affairs that we have in Britain at the moment. So, no, it doesn't go far enough. But then, you see, Boris knows his constituents, these people who can't survive without 2 cheap flights to Spanish islands every year.
Of course.
They do not look at the price they're paying for these things. How do you educate a population? I don't know. I don't think you, in some respects, you do. I think that it sounds anti-democratic and elitist, but I think that a core number of people manage to get a government elected who governs the people and acts against these, regardless of the potential electoral cost. I mean, democracy has its major Achilles heel, and one of them is expediency, or 2 things, expediency and short-termism. They're the same thing. They're built into democracy.
Of course. We'll come back to Scotland now for a moment for the next story, and that is that in a statement today, Police Scotland have said that there have now been more than 50 arrests in relation to the public disorder which followed Glasgow Rangers winning the Scottish Premier League on May 15th this year. 47 police officers were injured while trying to contain the scenes of drink-fueled vandalism. So, Peter, we know, as you've told us, as you've reminded us this evening, you're not of a sporting disposition in that sense, or organised sport in that sense. What's your reaction to the news that Police what's your reaction to the news of Police Scotland confirming that they have arrested more than 50 people now?
Delight is the only answer I can give, Andrew. I'd hope they were able to do this. And I don't do it on a basis of the perceived sporting affiliation or religious affiliation or whatever particular bigotry or sporting mania the people concerned were. A plague on all of their houses. We cannot accept this kind of behaviour on our streets, because that kind of behaviour very quickly can be converted into a kind of political behaviour. And I'm old enough to remember, as a living person on television, not old enough to remember actively the events that he participated in, Oswald Mosley. And as somebody reminded me in the paper today, Oswald Mosley didn't come from the right, he came from the left. So these people are thugs, and they're potentially political thugs, and they have to be dealt with, and dealt with the maximum severity the law permits.
That's a very good point that you make, Peter. Perhaps the view that just reminding people of what it is that as a society, as a community, we expect in terms of people's behaviour is not a bad thing, perhaps. Our penultimate story this evening is that a campaign has been launched encouraging people to choose a career in Scotland's valued tourism and hospitality industry. The advertising campaign launched today will promote the range of roles within the industry and help people find a job that suits their different skill sets. It will support businesses' full staff shortages that have occurred as a result of Brexit and encourage those aged 18 to 30 to play their part in helping businesses recover from the coronavirus pandemic by applying their skills to the diverse job opportunities available now. The campaign has been developed in conjunction with the sector and lead partner the Scottish Tourism Alliance and is supported by £100,000 of funding. So, Peter, perhaps there's another personnel and HR angle here. We've managed 3 stories this evening. What would you do in terms of attempting to recruit people under the age of 30 to work in Scotland's valued tourism and hospitality industry?
Well, I was never a direct part of that industry, but Scottish and Newcastle had a very large, well-developed and very effective hotels division. And through a friend and colleague in Scottish Brewers, delightful man, Alistair Wilson, sadly passed, he at a point in the game was a hotel manager. And he entertained us endlessly with his stories of the nature of hotel management. It's front of house, front of stage, if you like, gloss and welcoming, and the backstage in the kitchen of tourism and hospitality. And I met a lot of people who worked in tourism and hospitality, and they loved it. It's a very, very rewarding career. In a sense, I wish I had gone for it myself. Indeed, the son of a close friend of mine, very bright guy, went to Glasgow University, he got a degree in physics and then got a doctorate in physics and was headed for a big career in pharmaceuticals, or abandoned it all because of his love of Scotland, his love of Scottish steamers, of Scottish holidays, and devoted his career. I won't name his name, I don't want to be publicising anything, but he now operates and has operated successfully as a consultant in tourism and leisure. And it's very close to his heart, and all his intellect, all his talents are brought to bear on that sector, which is vitally important to Scotland's image, to Scotland's economy, and to the employment of Scottish people. And it does provide a very rewarding career. And I think what we used to call the milk round in Scottish and Newcastle, where we trawled the universities before degrees and got likely potential graduates into a hotel, put them through an assessment course. That's the place where you can really, by the experience of real live hotel managers, venue managers, show them what a really rewarding, dynamic career tourism and hospitality was. It calls on every skill, human skills, the skills of people relationships, the ability to entertain, the ability to communicate, the ability to feed. It is a delightful career and offers substantial rewards. So I'm all for it.
Thanks, Peter. That's a useful insight. And mentioning Alistair Wilson as well makes me smile. Our final story this evening is that eligible families can now apply for a grant of at least £120 to help with the cost of school uniforms. The Scottish Government and local authority leaders have reached an agreement to increase the national school clothing grant to a minimum of £120 per eligible primary school pupil and £150 per eligible secondary school pupil. This will be supported by £11.8 million of additional funding to local authorities. The announcement marks another commitment for the first 100 days of this Scottish Government. Eligible families can apply for the school clothing grant through their local council. So, Peter, earlier in the conversation, we were discussing the measure of a society and a community by the way in which it looks after perhaps the elderly, and this might be seen as a way, as an example of the way in which a community looks after perhaps the younger ones and also its families. You, as I will remember, fellow pupils at school who clearly were in difficult times and whose parents were struggling to provide uniforms, which seem to get more expensive every year. And of course, children get, the one thing you can guarantee is that children get bigger every year, so they need more school uniforms. What's your response to this news that the Scottish School Clothing Grant is being introduced now?
Well, first of all, Andrew, let's stick to the worldly argument whether there should be such a thing as school uniform or not. It's a very hotly contested argument.
Yes.
But if there is an argument that I favour in it, it means it masks the poverty and the inequalities of income between children. And that's a good thing. I don't like school uniform in the sense that it promotes conformity of behaviour and performance and values. I was brought up, you probably know it, by a widowed mother, the classic Glasgow misery story. Father died when I was 5, went to school. I was eligible for free school milk because everybody wasn't eligible in these days. So I didn't know it was a humiliation at the time until I got older, but I had to go out and say, I don't pay for my milk. And I immediately was identified to a class of 40 Glasgow robustious East End kids as a poor child. I managed to put on a reasonably brave front because of hand-me-downs from older relatives who were better off. But when I went to secondary school, when I went to St Mungo's Academy, there was a school uniform, there was a school badge, there was a jacket, and you could get away without doing it. But you immediately were marked the moment you entered the school gates as being a poor child. Now, children can be very, very cruel to their peers, as you know. So I support this. I think it's a good idea. I think it will come as an absolute godsend to some parents. And there's nothing worse than having an early teenager, because that's when it really bites, saying to you, I'm not going to school because I can't bear the humiliation of the way I'm dressed. You must buy me whatever. And the parent,
Of course.
in strapped circumstances. So totally in favour of it.
Of course. Thank you, Peter. And that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. Very many thanks to Peter for joining us and for sharing his thoughts and wisdom and experience. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we rely upon your support, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen. There are other ways in which you can also contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then and join us. But for this evening, thank you to Peter Curran for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening on Broadcasting Scotland. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.